Welcome to a special episode of Tough Topics. I'm your host, Vonny Sweetland. With the 2022 federal conservative leadership race underway, minds, eyes, and thoughts are all on the candidates who have declared that they're running. The vote is set to take place on September 10th, but the horses are already out of the barn, with some calling this a battle for the soul of the Conservative Party. Well, this morning I'm excited to announce that we have an exclusive interview with the Honourable Member of Parliament for Haldimand Norfolk and Leadership Candidate, Dr. Leslyn Lewis. MP Lewis, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Vonny. Thanks for having me here today.
Of course. Well, I'm going to jump right into it because it really is an honor to have you and there's so much to cover. You ran for leader in 2020, placing third, and of course now you're the representative for Haldimand Norfolk. What made you put your hat in the ring again this time around? And for the viewers that may not be familiar with you as a person, why should Canadians consider Dr. Leslyn Lewis as their leader of the Conservative Party?
Well, Vonny, unfortunately, a lot of the reasons why I ran last time are still present. Our country is very, very divided. We're seeing that our politicians are using hate and fear and demonization as a strategy to polarize. We're seeing that our economy is really in shambles right now. We need to rebound out of COVID. We need to unite the country. We need to find ways that we could work together as a nation to build prosperity and unity and just bring back the Canada that we were used to before COVID, rebounding us out of COVID, doing things like focusing on our environment, finding environmental solutions together that are not predicated on the backs of the least able to pay. And so those are some of the challenges that I think are very, very important, along with some of our freedoms that have been eroded and that we have to focus on making sure that we uphold our democracy and get back to trusting our democracy.
Sure. And as I said, for the folks that may not be familiar with you and maybe didn't tune in last election cycle, what do you say to those people and why should they vote for you as, again, their Conservative leader?
Well, I am not a traditional politician. I'm not one of the legacy politicians. I've spent most of my years in the private sector, building business, creating wealth, employing employees, teaching at the law school. I've taught at Osgoode Hall Law School. I've also taught at the University of Toronto and getting an education and raising a family. So I understand the challenges of the average Canadian. I haven't been in the bubble of Ottawa my entire life. And so when Canadians come to me with real challenges, I can actually think of life experiences that I share in commonality with them and find solutions that would really work to make our country a better place.
Of course. Well, the world was watching how Canada handled a large group of truckers who were seeking a change to a mandate that they felt was drastically affecting their livelihood, and frankly was. How do you think this situation could have been handled differently? Because I know you were on the ground in person.
Yes. So, Vonny, it wasn't only about the truckers' mandate. It was about things just like I have an 82-year-old client who contacted me, or a constituent who contacted me a few weeks ago, and their situation is that their daughter has to travel to visit a relative, an aging relative, and cannot do so because of the mandate that she cannot get on a plane because she's unvaccinated. And she's unvaccinated because of a medical reason, but she cannot get an exemption from her doctors because of the way the exemptions have been drafted. And so she communicated to me that she feels like a prisoner in her country. And so those are some of the issues that the truckers wanted to raise, not on their behalf, but on the behalf of Canadians who feel that the government should be listening to them about how the mandates are affecting them. And it's not as if this person is opposed to testing to make sure that she's safe on the plane, but that option is not guaranteed to her. It's not issued to her, but the country that she wants to travel to is willing to accept her, but her country, Canada, won't let her leave. And while I was on the ground, Vonny, I just want to tell you that I walked every day. My apartment was one street away from Parliament. So I walked through the crowds every day. I was never impeded from going into Parliament. And I did speak to the protesters. I did speak to the truckers, because I feel that if people came all from across the country, some even as far as British Columbia, and all they wanted to do was to speak to somebody. Many of them had tried to get through to their MPs, and they weren't getting answers. And so they decided to come here to speak to politicians, and they pay our salaries. And so I didn't see anything wrong with that. And I actually support people peacefully protesting to get their voice heard in this democracy.
Right. And I think a lot of what I've heard just from being out and about myself is that the Prime Minister didn't take the time to listen to the concerns of those people on the ground. Is that something you would, of course, do differently if elected Prime Minister?
I think absolutely, Vonny. Not only did he not take the time to listen, he didn't send any of his caucus to hear the concerns, and instead labeled people, tried to demonize them. Our government even put out misinformation about the convoy. They stated that these people, these normal working Canadians, were engaged in acts of sedition, which were not true. But it scared the average Canadian. So the average Canadian then did not want to listen to the concerns, which is wrong. We cannot be continuing to divide each other. We need to start listening to what each other have to say so that we can move forward in solving some of the problems. And as you know, Vonny, the most serious charges that were laid were mischief and conspiring to commit mischief. And so that's a far cry away from sedition and trying to overturn a government. And we've seen numerous news reporters come out and say that their coverage of the convoy was misleading, and they've retracted it. And so I'm very concerned about the plight of our democracy when we are trying to solve problems through demonization, hatred, pitting Canadians against each other. We just have to do better, Vonny. We need to do better.
I agree wholeheartedly. I'll tell you, on this show, and we call it Tough Topics for that reason, because we take the approach that no topic is too challenging. And even if it's a subject that some might feel is sensitive or divisive, we still have it, because our belief at this show is, in order to move forward, we have to have those tough conversations. So I agree, and I think, you know, when that doesn't happen, it really affects our ability to progress. On that note, shifting gears to an equally important terrain, I'm going to be honest, and I'm sure you've heard some of this as well. You've been accused at different points of not supporting the LGBTQ2+ community. And in 2020, there was some confusion about where you stood on the government ban to ban conversion therapy, which of course was recently made law of the land. I think there's been a lot of back and forth, and as you know in the press, you never know what's true from what's not. So I want to give you the opportunity to explain a little bit about where you stand both then and now on that subject, because I also took the time to do some research, and I know that what's interesting about you is in your past as a lawyer, you spent a lot of time working with LGBTQ2+ refugees who were seeking asylum in Canada. So do you feel there's some misconceptions that people may have about you on those issues?
Well, Vonny, to be honest with you, that's one of the most hurtful things about entering politics, is that I don't have a problem defending my positions, but I cannot defend a lie. If people put out lies about me, there's just no way to defend against that. And I'm grateful to people like you who have actually gone out and done the research to find out exactly what I'm about. And you are right, Vonny. I had one of the largest refugee practices that dealt with people who were fleeing persecution from really totalitarian regimes where their lives were threatened. I've had clients who were thrown from buildings. I've had clients who their fingers were cut off, who were placed in jail, who were brutally beaten. And some of the things that were done to them, I wouldn't even repeat because they're so grotesque. And these heinous acts were done because these individuals are members of the LGBTQ+ community. And so my practice dealt with assisting them to gain refugee status. And at that time, some people thought that that wasn't a grounds for refugee status, and I advocated on their behalf. And so it's very hurtful. Someone like myself who believes that every human being deserves to be treated with equal dignity and respect. When I hear people mischaracterizing my position, it's just, you don't know what to do, because you know that if it's an uninformed position and that they're basing it based on misinformation. And even the conversion therapy ban, Vonny, my position is really that if any practitioner decides to utilize a noxious substance to have somebody ingest such a substance or use electrical shock on a person, they should immediately lose their license. I've never advocated for such terrible practices. And I believe that every human being has a right to equal dignity and respect. And I have even worked very hard at even crafting, trying to modify the conversion therapy legislation, because I thought that it was being politicized. And really and truly, when you're dealing with especially young LGBTQ plus members' lives, this is not something that's up for political games. We need to make sure that these individuals are protected and that they can live their lives with equal dignity and respect. And as a legislator, Vonny, and previously as a lawyer, I don't look at identities. I look at the legislation. If we have a poorly drafted piece of legislation, my job is to make it better. And I'm not afraid to do that. And I will never be afraid to do that. And so when I saw the last incarnation of the conversion therapy ban, I said, this has an inadvertent outcome of perhaps penalizing parents and for innocent conversations. And the consequence could have been 5 years in prison. So I said, why don't we clarify this legislation so that we're explicit about the fact that it doesn't cover loving conversations between a parent and a child? And to a lesser extent, and to another extent, also looking at the impact on the clergy and practitioners. And so this is what I was trying to work with other groups at doing. And then, of course, people who want to politicize the issue then say that you're anti-LGBTQ plus. And these people have done far less than I've done in that community. They've worked with the community far less than I have. And the only thing that they can show is that they've marched in a parade, but they have, and virtue signal, but they have no substantive work or contact with the community. And so that is very frustrating for me, Vonny.
I would imagine. And, it seems that, to your point, so many are afraid to speak out on tough issues for fear of being canceled, quite frankly. How will you lead in a cancel culture society? Would it impact how you legislate and how you speak if you were elected leader or eventually potentially prime minister?
Well, Vonny, my motto is I'm just going to speak truth, whether I'm in the belly of the beast, no matter where I am, I'm going to speak the truth. And I am going to make sure that I do my job. And my job is as a legislator. So whether I get a piece of legislation that involves the Black community, the LGBTQ plus community, whatever community, I'm going to look at the legislative intent of that document and say, is this a strong document? Does it need to be modified? Yeah. And I'm not going to play politics with people's lives. And so people know that I am genuinely concerned about the well-being of the country, and I will act in the interest of the well-being of this country.
Right. And I think that's a great message to have. And to that point as well, we should talk a little bit about the term big tent, because as you know, the Conservative Party uses that term quite often in their description of broad inclusion. PM Stephen Harper really was the last Conservative leader, I would say, who was able to hold the party together. What do you think is needed to build and keep the party together and also be able to retain the broad diversity of values and policies that we have at the same time?
I think what's needed is the same thing that's needed, Vonny, to keep our country together. And that's just recognizing that people are going to have divergent perspectives and ideologies. And it's okay. It's okay for me to believe something different from someone else, especially if it's coming from a place of love and a place of improving our country and improving our party. So I see our party as almost like a microcosm of society. You have people on the left, you have people on the right, you have people in the middle. And it's not really about us against them. It's about how we can all work together, even on controversial issues, like even on an issue like abortion, Vonny. People, there's a middle ground. There are things that pro-life people believe in, that pro-choice people also believe in. And we probably have more in common than we don't have in common. But politicians like to polarize us and say it's us against them.
And that's a concern.
And I believe that it is a concern. I believe we have to move beyond that, Vonny. I think what we need to do is we need to get to the point where we can all work together for the betterment of all Canadians.
Yes, well, and listen, not just for the current Conservative Party leadership, but I say this across all political spectrums, whether it's the Liberals, the NDP, the Greens. I always fear election races getting nasty. I think that divisiveness seems like it could rear its ugly head this cycle, just from some of the media that you see, some of the articles that you read. What is the approach you're going to be taking as a leadership candidate to sort of take the high road and keep the focus on the issues?
Well, that's a very good question, Vonny. I think it's important to realize that I will challenge people on their policies, but I will not make personal attacks on people. I will not spread falsehood about people so that I can be looked at as more favorable. I will hope that Canadians will listen to the policies that I have, will see my sincerity, and will understand that I'm here because I really believe in Canada. I believe that we have a bright future ahead and that our path it's a very narrow path to bring us back to our true democratic ideals. But I believe that we can do that if we work together.
Of course. Let's talk about the economy for just a moment. Inflation is at an all-time high. The cost of living is going up. Wages are staying the same. Housing affordability is a crisis all across this country. Many businesses have not bounced back from COVID. We're running an astronomical deficit. The list really does go on. If Prime Minister, how would you tackle the issue of inflation and ensure that the cost of living is not out of reach for most Canadians?
Well, there are a number of things. I think we just have to focus on believing in ourselves. Again, as Canadians, we need to focus on rebuilding and helping the small and medium businesses get back on their feet. They employ over 80% of all Canadians, Vonny. And when they prosper, all Canadians prosper. We also have to focus on being self-sufficient. Look at the crisis that we're in right now with the oil crisis. We did not build pipelines, and now we're recognizing that that was a fatal error. We could have built our pipelines. We could have had our oil and gas on to Tidewater over in Europe, supplying and offsetting that 40% of Russian oil that Europe is dependent on. We could have been energy self-sustaining here. We have the third largest accessible oil reserves on the planet, yet we leave it tapped in the ground because of discriminatory legislation like Bill C-48, Bill C-69, which prohibits the development of local oil. And this is legislation that was brought in by our government, the Trudeau government. And so we need to focus on opening up our supply chains, creating wealth within our country, being self-sufficient, reviving our economy, and then taking those revenues and then paying down our national debt, which is at $1.3 trillion. We need to make sure that we do not saddle future generations with debt.
And what do you say to opposition who may say, well, look, all of that sounds great, but we don't want to do these things at the expense of the environment?
It does not have to be done at the expense of the environment. These concepts are not, environmental sustainability and economic development are not mutually exclusive concepts. There are Canadian companies that are engaged in green energy projects, solar projects, which are very viable in other parts of the world. And we're looking at a world environmental issue right now. So we can't say that we're going to punish ourselves and not develop our resources here, but yet we let China off the hook. It's one globe and the pollution doesn't stop at the borders of China. So we need holistic solutions. Our oil is probably the most equitable oil on the planet. We have the strongest environmental policies on the planet for oil development and extraction. And so producing here is actually of benefit to our entire economy. And we also have, it doesn't mean that you're not going to have aspects of our economy that also focus on green energy or green development. But right now, we're not there yet. So the fact that we're still reliant on oil, it should be Canadian oil rather than imported oil.
Yes, yes. No, and I've heard these arguments before. And just sort of touching on what the Western world is going through and what's happening in Ukraine right now, how might you, as the potential Prime Minister of this country, handle the conflict in Ukraine differently if given the opportunity?
Well, I think that one thing that we need to do in long term is we need to make sure that we're contributing the right amount of our spending to NATO. We have not been paying our fair share of NATO. A second issue is we need to look at opening up the visa requirements for people of Ukraine and giving immediate passage to get them out of that conflict zone. We also need to make sure that we are supporting them on a military front. In addition, right here, we have to make sure that our Arctic is protected. Russia, if Russia can invade Ukraine, our Arctic is also vulnerable. The Russian military has 40 ice-breaking submarines. We have 0. Our military capacity has to be improved. And in addition, we need to build our pipelines, get our oil to Tidewater, and offset some of that oil revenues that Russia is getting. We're basically right now, because we're not getting our oil to market, we are basically aiding the Russian economy by allowing them their oil to get into places like Europe.
Yeah.
We could offset that.
And I'll tell you, I don't disagree with you on the point of ensuring that Canada's military is well funded and has the resources that it needs to protect its interests in the Arctic. This is something that I frankly speak about at the dinner table. I think we've got a problem where that is regarded, and I think we need to make sure that we're stepping things up and ensuring that Canada is able to perform both in the Arctic and frankly on the world stage at a time when, as we see, defense is a commodity that folks should really be looking at. COVID has highlighted weaknesses in Canada's health systems. What is needed to ensure Canadians have access to quality healthcare, and particularly quality healthcare at an affordable cost?
Well, I think that what we need to do is we need to make sure that our supply chains are intact. We need to make sure that never again are we reliant on foreign countries for basic supplies like masks and gloves. We also need to make sure that our health system is responsive. If we have a pandemic and our health policy is based on overloading our healthcare system, it means that our healthcare system is not responsive enough to deal with a pandemic. And so we need to create policies such as maybe more long-term care centers that will be able to shift the elderly over to facilities that could take care of them on a better level, and have our emergency rooms expanded so that they can be able to ramp up in times of need, such as during a pandemic.
Right. Well, let me ask you a very special question, and I think it's an important one. What would it mean to you to be the first female Prime Minister of color in this country?
Well, I am here because I represent all Canadians, Vonny. And so I look at the fact that I look at my policies. I look at the fact that I am representative of all Canadians. And I think that opening doors for people who haven't seen themselves traditionally as occupying certain professions and certain roles, I think that it would be very wonderful for people to look and say, okay, here's a role model, but not just because of my color or my gender, because of what I have to offer, my educational background, the fact that I've spent years preparing for this job outside of politics, in the entrepreneurial world, in the world of academia. And so other young people will know what it takes to get here and will aspire towards that. And so I think that is the most important thing, Vonny, that people can see that anything is achievable in this great country of Canada.
Well, extremely well said, Dr. Leslyn Lewis. Thank you so much for joining us today on Tough Topics. It's been a real pleasure. And of course, I wish you luck in September.
Thank you, Vonny, and thank you for being such a good friend. Thank you.
Absolutely. Leadership races are important because they elect the leaders that potentially could go on to become the Prime Minister, the highest office in our country. It was a pleasure speaking with Dr. Leslyn Lewis, and it was a pleasure listening to a plethora of different perspectives, ideologies, and I think she touched on a few important things. Divisiveness in this country is at an all-time high, and the key is listening, ensuring that all of us are able to contribute to the conversation so that we can move things forward. And as always, that is what we do here on this show. I'm Vonny Sweetland, your host of Tough Topics, where all voices matter.